Akong Vox of YouTube. It's me again, your pal Nani, and today we are going to be talking about technology. This was a stupidly late video in my last run of this series, mostly because I kinda forgot I hadn't done it eventually. So let's just take a look at it. So, for starters, I'm going to be mentioning some important lines and important text. If you saw the first video, you're going to know most of these, but I will have a few things to add, and mostly why. First things first, light armament is very important. The guns you get from these armaments, especially this tech in particular, drastically help your army, even if doctrinally they're not doing so good. The best trained troops in the world armed with flintlock rifles will do no good against a country with bolt actions. That's as simple as that. And I will spoil this much, the light armament category is so wacky and nonsensical that in basically every mod you're ever going to see, it's changed at least a little bit. So keep that in mind, but for the most part, even within that spectrum, you're always going to want better guns. Ship construction is another very important line of technologies as they enable you to build bigger and better ships. And once again, same principle. The very best man of war in the world still doesn't really have any chance whatsoever against a horrible dreadnought. Unless it's really, really, really messed up, and even then you will still very rarely see it do significant damage. I feel like ship designs, as far as your chances of winning naval combat go, are a lot more important than infantry weapons in particular, in the way that, as I mentioned, even the best man of war in the world versus a horribly trained, almost dead dreadnought is still almost never going to be able to actually damage it because of the hull statistic. So, you will have very many scenarios where even a couple of modern ships will wipe the floor with some of the base models. But on the downside, naval combat is unapologetically not as important as land combat in Victoria 2, not even close, and in a lot of wars, it's simply never going to become a real issue. The only time you're really going to have to be worrying about naval combat is if you just want a few more war score against a specific nation, if you don't want their navy to be out and about, or if you're invading a nation with a lot of islands, like the Ottoman Empire, or entirely composed of them, like the British Isles. Still, it's generally good to, even if you have nothing else, be vaguely up to date on your ship construction, so these techs tend to run a bit on the expensive side, and, you know, if you go a few years behind, that's okay. Just try not to be 2 techs behind the modern ship, then you should be fine. This is a very important tech that's not really a very important tree. In fact, for the most part, commerce and culture, well, actually no, I'll say just commerce is probably going to be your weakest tree here. If you're here, you're usually going to be coming for something specific. However, usually decisions I find, or you just have nothing else worth researching. However, freedom of trade in particular, as well as I believe market structure and business regulations, are quite powerful techs, very drastically increasing your RGO, which in other words means how many goods you're producing. We'll talk a bit more about that when we get to production and provinces, but basically these 3 techs right here are pretty good. You might want to invest in them. For the most part though, I will spoil that most of these are not exactly huge, and this is a tech that you should never research because of this. Don't want this. You don't want this, right? You don't want this. And because there's no way to make it impossible to unlock, you don't want this. We'll talk about what exactly this little light bulb symbol and this in particular is in a bit, but yeah, don't research this tech, please. Unless you're in a mod where this does something different, don't research this. It's a bad idea. Anyway, a couple of important things in culture. For starters, your philosophy tab makes you research faster. This is very important, especially in the base game, as you'll often find that it's very difficult to knock out all the techs you want in good time. So, like, especially the first few techs, I find they're so important that I often save up research points for them, which, by the way, if you're not actively researching, those points aren't going to waste. You are saving up research points. Not entirely efficient, but you are doing it. one of the few techs I save for, especially idealism and empiricism. If I finish a technology like a year in advance of 1840 or 1860, which, by the way, activation year, very important, get to it, I will generally save up for them. Very important, very good techs, and if you get a good leg up on these, you can be very far ahead of basically every other country. Political thought gives you more national focuses. National focuses are good, even if you haven't seen the upcoming National Focus episode or the last one I did from the last round of this series. Just know this. National focuses are good. Revolution and counter-revolution is a bit of a mixed bag, because that gives you a lot of nasty little discoveries over here. But mass politics is fine. And you always just want to have more national focuses. It's just really good. They help you direct your country. They're really good. I should also mention that biologism, or biologism, I don't know how you pronounce it exactly, I've just read it, is another nice tech because it gives you a massive 50% increase in education efficiency. I've never felt like this was a super huge priority, but some people really swear by this tech, so I have to at least mention it here. Everything you see on the screen is important. You want all of this, but in particular, you want railroads and chemistry. Chemistry helps you with your supply limit, which is really important if you don't want people dying, and it also massively increases in a lot of places the amount you can get in your economy. Some of these techs in medicine give you a lot of prestige, they unlock very good things for you. There's any real economic technology, ironically, that you can really trust, it's going to be chemistry and electricity. If you invent production of some of these, like, for instance, vacuum tubes, well, not vacuum tubes, but let's say the telephone early, you can get a massive economic advantage that's going to be hard to top. Railroads are very good because that's your infrastructure, basically, in this game. Makes your troops move faster, improves the economy, basically is a buff to your provinces. You always want more railroads. So with that being now said, let's touch on some basic principles and then go over all of the lines. So, as you can see here, we have your standard technology. You can see these by clicking on any of these things. Now, over here, these are what they call inventions. Now, these might seem like they mean the same thing, but in actuality, an invention is basically a bonus perk that you have a chance to get every month by having this technology. For instance, by owning, let's get a big one. Mechanical production, right? Every month we would have a 2% chance to unlock this Sharpen Roberts power loom, which would help us make more cotton and wool. Having these specific technologies makes that chance even better. Beyond this, there's also, of course, the activation year, which is an important thing to know. Certain huge techs like nationalism, imperialism, machine guns, and biologism, if that's your thing, as well as your next level railroad, your next level of gun, your next level of ship, so on. Very important to know what year that's going to be coming out, because you can't, unlike most other Paradox games, you can't do ahead of time research. You can only research up to your activation year. In addition to that, your activation year is also going to generally control your research points, and on top of that, an older tech will be obviously cheaper. Research points are just simply how many points you have to invest to unlock said tech. You can see how many of these you make a day by this little magnifying glass up here. You can also see why you have these things. This represents your literacy. We'll talk more about that when we talk about your population, but let's just say it like this: high literacy, better. Always. I don't care what any 1400s king will tell you, a more literate population is always a good thing in Victoria 2. So, one final basic principle is up here you have your research administration. Right now it's a traditional academia, but other certain countries will have different modifiers. You may have seen it on the very first episode when we were the Ottoman Empire. We had a military-industrial complex. Basically, if you have a specific school of specific research administration, which I call the school of thought, there's several terms for it. It basically just means this thing up here. you'll have a different icon. Let's say you'll have the Army icon with a plus, or the Navy icon, the anchor, with a minus. That basically means that you get a bonus to certain techs and a malus to others. There's several schools of thought, some of them more useful than others. For instance, you probably don't want business schools and tycoons, because that gives you a lot of commerce, and you don't need commerce very much, as a general rule. Compared to industry, compared to your army, compared to culture, it's just not very competitive. So, you can basically tune those to your will, because they're not very hard to unlock and to get. In fact, usually by 1840 to 1850, you'll be able to see the decision where you can turn into one of these schools of thought. And in particular, Prussia into the German Empire, if you form it outside of Prussia, you also get the decision, if they haven't done it yet, gets the ability to have the Junkers here and Krupp tech team. And what that means is that they get bonuses to basically everything, and they only take a malus to their naval research, and that is the best one in the game. So if you're playing as Prussia or Germany, or you're planning to form Germany, always, always, always go for that one. Even if you want to be naval, you get so much benefit from having such a fast army research, such a fast industry research. You always want it. Anyway. So now let's talk about the specific lines of text in themselves. Army doctrine controls how big your forts can get. Forts are a nice thing in general because they make a province harder to occupy, and if a unit is defending there, it gets a bonus. Enemy units, by the way, cannot use your forts. That's something I've learned since the last series. Cannot use your forts, so you basically, aside from lag, you want to have these in basically all of your outward provinces, or anywhere you feel like might be under threat for one reason or another. Also, probably want to have one in your capital, because even if your capital isn't directly threatened by outsiders, sometimes it can be threatened by your own people, and it's never a good thing to lose your capital during a bigger rebellion. So, forts are generally, the army doctrine is generally a good thing to expand on. Besides allowing your forts to build higher, they also increase your digging cap, which basically means a unit on the defense will be more entrenched and more able to defend effectively. Light armament gives you better guns for your core of the infantry. They come in, aside from this one just gives you a bunch of random garbage, which basically does the same thing as a new rifle, as well as this one, which is a nice little invention, as your armies are starting to take a ridiculous amount of supplies. Rifles make your units take more supplies outright. We'll talk about supply and demand and as far as armies go in their own little video. But these will make sure that your army just is more effective in combat. They'll give them higher attacks, they'll give them higher defense, and also they unlock some new types of units. You're going to get your regular infantry, you're going to get your engineers, you're going to get your guards from these techs. In particular of note, machine guns is a very important and good tech. If you know history, you know why. If you don't know history, you could still probably figure it out. Artillery is probably the weakest line of techs in this tree, aside from heavy armament, which is quite a nice one. Artillery is going to be a decently common unit, but these techs that only apply to it are kind of keynote. Essentially, if you're going for a decision, go for it. If you want a strong army, why not? But if you're just a country that's kind of going for a more balanced approach, or if you're not really a huge on artillery, these can generally wait. I still like to get them, but they can wait. Not a huge priority tag. Aside from military SAF system, which lets you build the regular types of cavalry, and aeronautics, which let you build planes, the military science tree mostly deals with organization. Organization is probably the second most important thing to a military after armament, so this is generally a good tree to have. Oh, by the way, I almost forgot to mention, infiltration lets you build tanks. Tanks are good. You'll want tanks. But planes are good as well, so you want aeronautics. Definitely infiltration, MGs, and aeronautics are the three big techs here. Heavy armament coming pretty close, and as well as modern division structure. Army leadership gives you higher morale and military tactics. Morale is your organization recovery, and military tactics lets you take less casualties in battle. This is the other it can wait category, I think. Especially if you're not a military-focused nation. And if you're not, you should generally be focused mostly on light arms and doctrine, I should mention. But Army leadership is the other just B-listed tagline of this. You never get a huge, aside from, I believe, they're good for unlocking other inventions, but for the most part, these are just little B tags. Nice to have, always good to avoid casualties, especially considering soldiers are physical people in this game, but it can wait. So your Navy. Naval Doctrine lets you build up your naval bases. Naval bases can supply farther and give you more colonial power points, which are always nice to have. We'll talk about those in a future episode, or in a past episode if you really want to go watch that. Naval bases of higher level repair faster, and you also get some nice inventions. If you're a naval-focused nation, this is going to basically be your second most important category right after ship construction. Naval bases are always nice to have, and several ship designs require a baseline amount of naval base, so always be considerate of that if you're going to try and go for ship construction. In fact, there are some times where you're going to want naval doctrine first, but you're going to be getting them for ship construction, so I don't consider it a line tag. Just important. Ship constructions give you bigger, badder ship designs, and I've already kind of talked at length about this. But beyond that, they also give little perks to existing ship designs or construction of these ship designs. For instance, advanced battleships will give you, better battleships. Simple, huh? Also, the base text will also make your navies faster, and a faster navy is always kind of nice to have. Naval engineering helps you fix one of the biggest problems in ships in that they take so very, very, very long to construct. This is very much an all-or-nothing tech. If you want to really focus on your navy, you want all of these. If you aren't really going to be investing much into it, you can almost ignore it outright. Simple as that. And there are several nations where you are better off not really caring about your navy. Most notably, landlocked ones or uncivs. So, as I said, it's all or nothing. This is, definitely the third most important tech for a naval-focused nation, but the least important line in this tree if you're not naval-focused. The Naval Science tab mostly deals with supply range and inventions that make your navies better with organization. Sometimes they get fire range, sometimes they get crazy things like torpedoes. Though inventions like that mostly come in the naval engineering category. Naval Science, always good to have. This is more important than naval engineering, as is leadership for that matter. If you're not really a naval-focused nation, but you still want to have a sea presence, because supply range will really help you when you're trying to get, especially trying to get ships back and forth. It is really not very fun to have, let's say, a capital in Europe, and you're trying to throw a ship out to some island in the Pacific. They will take a lot of damage, they won't be combat ready when they get there, and they might even sink on the journey, because ships out of supply can get lost in treacherous water, so later on in the game this will become rarer and rarer. So Naval Science is pretty decent for it trying to be a very good efficiency tech for Navy. So if you're naval focused, or even if you're not, consider it like that. It's basically your Navy efficiency. Another efficiency principle is organization. Now, naval organization is, unlike armies, it's not nearly as important as the actual strength of your navy itself. So this is another definite pass sort of tech tree, though not as much as the naval engineering, of course. Another generally pass tree if you're not really navally focused, but it's not even a A-tier thing to have if you are navally focused, but you get nice techs from time to time, and they're always good for making your navy stronger. Commerce. As I said, commerce is probably going to be the weakest tree in general, but it's still worth talking about. Financial institutions help your tax efficiency. You might think that's always a good thing, but it's not always a necessary thing. Basically, if you're taxing the hell out of your people but you're still not making money, you want one of these. If not, it's definitely a B-lister tech. Monetary systems help your administration efficiency. That's going to be how much this costs. Sometimes, it doesn't look very big here, but if you're especially a larger empire, you control a lot of uncivilized or, I guess more accurately, colonial territory, you are going to have huge administration upkeep, so making that go down a little bit and making the actual bureaucrats themselves better at their jobs will just simply make your nation more profitable. Again, if you're losing money, go for them. If you're not, don't. If you're smart, don't go for market-determined exchange rates. Remember that. Remember this little invention, because you don't want more consciousness and a higher factory cost, and especially one that is 10% higher cost. That's not very nice. Especially considering these give, not these, but, not these either. Oh, jeez, I've forgotten which baseline tech reduces your factory cost. Maybe not even outright. I guess it'll be a learning adventure for the both of us. Oh, right, it's this. These basically just overwrite one of these techs. But either way, you don't want it. Economic thought and critique may very well be, one of the more important lines here in commerce, but that doesn't make it, again, an A-line tech. Factory input efficiency basically means that your factories need less raw resources to make a final product. And that's nice and all, but it's such a small little bonus, only 1%, that it basically barely matters. You do get a lot of nice text, mostly in the permanent prestige, so occasionally you also get I believe actually all of these are just permanent prestige, so cancel that. Market functionality. These three techs are really important. These three techs are some of the worst in the game. Don't even think about them unless you have nothing else to research. Organization. Besides the very first one that lets you build canned food, basically go for output efficiency tech, and if it wasn't for the last three market functionality techs being horrible, this might be the least effective line in the game. Output efficiency is already, basically good enough with the default line. Unless you're really seeking to get a lot of juice out of these factories, these barely make a difference at all unless you get all of them. So you can basically save this for when you have nothing else to research. I would go so far as to say, unless you're a non-naval nation where naval engineering would take the cake, this might be the least important tree in the whole game. So consider it as such. Culture, romanticism. If you're a veteran to this game, maybe you're checking out this video as a matter of interest or to try and pick up something new, you're probably very familiar with some of the text on this tree. The aesthetics tree gives you new art forms, and new art forms give you increased prestige gain, and these technologies here which give you share prestige. Share prestige basically means that the first person to get this specific invention is going to get 10 prestige, and then the one after that is going to get like 7.5, and then the one after that 0.5, so on and so forth, and they will cap down at 1 prestige. This basically means that the first country to unlock this, these specific inventions gets quite a bit of prestige, and so the first country to unlock these specific aesthetics will get quite a few. As a secondary power, trying to be a great power, or as a civilized nation trying to become a secondary power, these technologies are kind of invaluable. If you're finding it really difficult to get into the position, get on that table with the big boys, or for that matter, stay on if things aren't looking so hot, this is where you want to go. Of course, like many lines, that makes this a very circumstantial tech, so consider it like that. Not always worth going for, especially if you're a solidified great power, or if you're already leading the world for prestige by a pretty good margin, you don't really need to care. But if you're not, if you're trying to break in, great tech for that. Now, the philosophy tree, as I stated, is probably, I would say overall, I would make a strong argument for philosophy being the most important tech tree in the entire game. Research points are few and far between. Technologies are huge in Victoria 2. They're one of the most important factors in playing this game. And there are so many very important ones that come up so consistently, these included in that you always want to be researching as fast as you possibly can. And these will give you the most direct increase of that on the entire tech tree. To the point where they're often nerfed in many mods, so consider that if you're in modding. And incidentally, I'll talk more on length about that at the end of the video. But in base Victoria 2 especially, and still in many mods, they're just really, really important. And oftentimes you'll get a share prestige out of these as well. So that's also nice. Education efficiency is another circumstantial tech. If you're Prussia, for instance, you are basically never going to need any of these. If you're a more minor nation, or more importantly, you're trying to get this literacy up, which is what that education stat goes to, then yeah, you probably want these. Higher literacy makes you research faster, gives you a bunch of perks, so they're good to have if you have a low efficiency. As Central America, for instance, it'll probably be a good idea for me to invest in this, but if you're a country like Australia, if you're a country like New Zealand, if you release those, like the US, like Prussia and Germany, that's going to have a high literacy rate no matter what, you can skip these. Again, circumstantial. I've already talked about political thought. I've already talked about how this is not the most important line, but this is definitely the most important tech. This right here, nationalism and imperialism, the most important tech in the game by a pretty wide margin. So, you know, that should tell you about the importance of these sorts of things. Always nice to have, and definitely an A line to invest in. Psychology gives your units more experience and gives you better unit reinforcement. And you might be thinking, well, that sounds like an army technology. What is that doing here? And if I had to respond to that, I would say I have no idea and I've never figured it out. This is a completely army tech, so if you're an army-focused military nation, go for it. If you're not, if you're a more balanced approach, or if you're naval-focused like the UK or something, yeah, maybe skip it. B-line tech. Water wheel power, electrical power generation. Isn't it amazing how much the power tree advanced in the Victorian era? Power, especially if you're running the base game, is huge. Even here, it's still pretty big. These increase the amount you get from production, you know, RGO. These increase, you know, just straight up how many goods you're going to output. These increase just straight up, you know, how much money you're making. I mean, it's basically the most direct sort of thing that there is. You make more products, you make more money. Some of these, like this, it let you create specific new types of products. Definitely an A-list, A-line tech tree. Mechanization is also pretty good. This isn't as much of a direct, you know, unlock this tech, get money, but it's more of the investment sort. The inventions you get, courtesy of the mechanization tree, are pretty big. They also give you a lot more production output, usually in more specific areas, and as you've just seen, also give you a couple of new specific types of production. Especially closer to the end, like the assembly line techs, these are pretty big. You know, 20% production of all types of like cattle, fish, and fruit. Those are common provinces. You can be the king of cows. This is another, I would say, A-list tech tree. In fact, I would say of all these here, all of industry is pretty important aside from one specific tree. That tree being metallurgy, which is definitely the B-lister of this specific tree. Again, as you can probably guess, the reason is because it's completely circumstantial. Though it's a lot more circumstantial than many other nations. To give you an idea, I'm not going to go too much into this, but to give you an idea of about how much these are going to be useful, you know, you can see, yeah, sure, the USA has a lot of coal, but Latin America, not really. Europe has a fair amount. Africa, basically none. Asia, not a lot. You know, let's see. Outright, you know, iron. And that's really quite rare, especially at this stage in the game. And that's going to be most of what this tree involves. Some countries are going to get a lot of mileage out of this. In particular, Prussia, Sweden, and the United States are probably going to get the most mileage out of these techs overall. Especially if the US wants to go into Canada, because, you know, you got that iron here, you got iron over here. But other than that, you know, like, right now I have one iron-producing province. Colombia has not even that many. Haiti, none. Venezuela, none. Ecuador, none. Paraguay, Uruguay, none. Even if Paraguay got all of its cores, it would still have none. Argentina, one. You know, Sokoto, none. Not even close to any. Ottoman Empire, two, I think that is. Maybe three. Yeah, it's three. 5. 6, if they take this province right here. 7, actually counting this. That's still not too many. Romania, none. You know, most of, like, European Russia, none. Only in the Urals, this province in Crimea, so on. As you can tell, you know, basically the point is, it's a rare resource. If you have it, it can be great. If you don't, it's a definite skip. The only real thing you get of value here is steel, and even importing that to turn it into steel is a pretty good investment. It also lets you build small arms, but beyond that, you know, I shouldn't have to tell you, you don't need coal production output if you're not producing any coal. So, B-lister tech. I've already told you how railroads are important, and there's basically nothing to add there, and supply limit, and new inventions in chemistry. And that's basically the lot of it. So, to add on to that, I'm going to talk about some specific things you see commonly in mods. For starters, as I said, usually these are pretty much scrambled up. You'll often see another technology outright. Again, Pop Demand mod. You're going to be seeing that many times. Army Doctrines, Infiltration, Heavy Armament, Aeronautics, techs like these, you know, are nerfed. Several times you'll see buffs in commerce. For instance, again in PDM, that's, if you couldn't tell, with the mod family I'm a little more familiar with compared to everything else. You're going to see these economic thought and critique, which are pretty weak techs. You'll see them start to increase your research points, as well as the philosophy techs, which become invention-based research points. You know, they'll nerf biologism and spread the benefits around the tree. They'll nerf nationalism and imperialism, or as I like to call it, natty and empy. So on. So, in other words, basically what I've just tried to explain to you in a very long fashion is that always just determine what you need the most when it comes to technology, because that is your prime factor in, you know, the decision you should make. The only exception being you always want more research points. Even the A-list lines, like light armament here, like power, like infrastructure, you can sometimes put off, and sometimes you want to do so. So be considerate before you take a technology, because it's a long road of an investment, and you lose all of it if you try to give it up. So, with that now being said, I hope you now have a better understanding of technology in Victoria 2. If you want to hear more on the subject, write in the comments and I'll probably give you a reply. If you've got any further questions, obviously do the same. If you want to see a specific video on a future subject, make sure to drop one. Likes and subscriptions are, as always, appreciated, and I will see you next time on Let's Explain Victoria 2. Now, I'm playing as one of my favorite countries, so if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and play Victoria 2.